A single photograph sat in a climate-controlled box for more than a century. At first glance, it was simple. A black family in their Sunday best, a painted studio backdrop, a father with a carpenter's posture, a mother with one hand resting lightly against a chair, 5 children arranged by height, trying not to blink. But in the bottom corner of that portrait, a little boy was holding still for history. And history had not been looking closely enough. When the photograph was finally scanned at a resolution high enough to show the fibers in the paper, the machine crossed the boy's right hand. 1 finger, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then a 6th. Not a blur, not a crease, not a shadow from the studio lamp. A complete 6th finger, tucked beside his pinky, plain as a signature. For 122 years, everyone had admired the family's dignity. Nobody had noticed the inheritance resting against the father's trouser leg, until the machine saw what the century had missed. Savannah, Georgia, November 1901. The studio of Elias Bennett stood above a dry goods shop on Broughton Street, up a narrow stairway that smelled of dust, wool coats, and photographic chemicals. Bennett was known among black families along the coast for one quiet reason. He did not rush them. He did not pose them like curiosities. He did not force them into the cheap backdrops reserved for people who were expected to accept less. And he did not laugh when a laboring family arrived, dressed as if the whole city would have to acknowledge them. That afternoon, the Cedar family climbed the stairs. Isaac Cedar came first. He was 48, a joiner at the river shipyards, the kind of man who could cut a board by sound and feel where a plank would twist before it ever touched water. He wore a dark wool suit that had been brushed until it shone at the elbows. His boots were polished, but the hands at his sides still carried the pale scars of tools. Beside him stood his wife, Ruth. She wore a high-necked dress of deep blue cotton, carefully pressed, with a narrow lace collar she had remade from an older garment. Her face was calm, but not soft. Ruth had lived through enough of the Reconstruction years and the years after to understand that dignity was not decoration. It was armor. Their children followed in a careful line. Elijah, the oldest, already working with his father in the yards. Martha, 15, tall and serious. Susanna, 12, fighting a smile. Caleb, 10, stiff in a collar he hated. And Jonah. Jonah was 8 years old, small for his age, alert-eyed, and visibly trying to obey every adult instruction at once. Bennett arranged the family beneath a painted backdrop of velvet curtains and bookcases. It was not their parlor. It was not their life. But Isaac had paid for the best sitting, and the fantasy mattered. It said, "This family belongs inside a frame." Bennett moved a carved side table closer. He set a closed Bible on top. Then he placed Isaac at the center, Ruth seated beside him, the older children fanning outward, and Jonah at the front, just to Isaac's right. "Still now," Bennett said. Jonah pressed his right hand against his father's trouser leg. Isaac looked down only once. There was no embarrassment in his face, no instruction to hide the hand, no quick correction, only the smallest nod. "Hold it there." Jonah held it there. The lens opened. For several seconds the family did not move. Light settled on Ruth's collar, Isaac's watch chain, the children's faces, the painted books, the polished shoes, and on Jonah's right hand, 6 fingers, all visible, all still. 2 weeks later, Isaac returned for the finished print. It cost him nearly a full week of wages. He carried it home wrapped in brown paper and hung it in the front room, where visitors could see the Cedar family exactly as they had chosen to be seen. Not bent, not hidden, not asking permission to exist. Years passed. Children left Savannah. A hurricane damaged the roof. A grandson carried the photograph north in a trunk. A great-granddaughter taped the torn backing. Another relative donated it to a regional archive in 1984, along with 2 hymnals, a bill of sale for ship timber, and a rusted cabinet-maker's plane with 6 tiny notches cut into the handle. The photograph was catalogued as Cedar Family Portrait, Savannah, Georgia, circa 1901. Photographer, Elias Bennett. Researchers praised the clothing, the posture, the rare image of Black prosperity in the coastal South after Reconstruction. But the hand remained invisible, not because it was hidden, because nobody knew to look. In February of 2024, Mara Ellison was digitizing portraits for the Low Country Freedom Archive. Her work was slow, precise, and easy to underestimate. She spent whole days lifting photographs out of acid-free folders, checking corners for damage, aligning them under glass, and waiting while the scanner read history one thin strip at a time. Most images asked for patience. This one asked for attention. The cedar portrait came out of storage on a gray Monday morning. The ink on the catalog sleeve had faded. The backing board was brittle. Someone decades earlier had written "Family of Ship Carpenter" in pencil along the edge. Mara liked the image immediately. Isaac's suit was formal, but his hands betrayed labor. Ruth's gaze was steady enough to make the room feel smaller. The children looked dressed for a future the city had not agreed to give them. Mara placed the photograph on the scanner bed. She set the resolution higher than usual because the print had silvering along the edges. The digital image filled her monitor in bands. First the backdrop, then the parents, then the older children, then the floorboards, and then Jonah. Mara was about to enter the routine condition notes when something caught the light near the boy's right hand. At first, she thought it was a fold in Isaac's trousers. She zoomed in. The fold became a line. She zoomed again. The line became a finger. Mara stopped breathing. "Wait," she whispered. She counted on the screen. Thumb, index, middle, ring, pinky. And beside the pinky, another finger. Smaller, yes, but not a nub, not an error. A jointed, formed, resting finger. Mara leaned so close, her reflection appeared faintly in the monitor glass. The child in the portrait had post-axial polydactyly on his right hand, and the photograph had preserved it more clearly than any written record could have. She did not announce it right away. Archives teach caution. The first enemy of discovery is wanting too badly to have found one. Mara rescanned the image. She rotated the file. She checked the original under magnification. She looked for tears, scratches, chemical stains, double exposure, retouching marks. There were none. The sixth finger was real. By lunchtime, she had pulled every object from the cedar donation. The hymnals, the timber receipt, the cabinet maker's plane, 3 loose church programs, a small envelope of funeral cards, and the tool handle with 6 notches carved near the heel. That was when the photograph stopped being a curiosity. It became a door. Mara called Dr. Theo Baptiste at Emory, a historian of medicine who studied hereditary conditions in African American families and the dangerous history of how those families had been studied without respect. He listened quietly as she described the image. Then he asked the question that mattered. Did the family hide the boy's hand? Mara looked back at the scan. Jonah stood in front. His hand rested in the open. His father knew. The photographer saw enough to pose him. No, Mara said. That's the thing. They didn't hide it at all. Theo arrived 2 days later. He stood in the archive viewing room with cotton gloves on, bent over the original photograph, then over the magnified scan. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled, not with amusement, but recognition. That hand meant something to them. Mara slid the tool across the table. The 6 notches were shallow, worn smooth by years of use. Theo turned it under the lamp. Or it meant something long before him. The first confirmation came from a church register at First Bryan Baptist. Jonah Cedar had been baptized in 1902. The minister's handwriting was small and crowded, but beside the child's name, in a line normally used for family notes, he had written, "Received with the 6th ridge of his father's people." Mara read the sentence 3 times. "The 6th ridge," she said. Theo sat back slowly. Not 6 fingers, not deformity, not defect. Ridge. A word from wood, a word from grain, a word a carpenter would understand. From that moment, they stopped looking only for medical evidence. They began looking for family language. And the Cedar family had left more of it than anyone expected. A 1906 shipyard pay ledger listed Isaac Cedar as finish joiner, River Sheds, premium hand. A 1911 insurance appraisal described a cedar chest made by I. Cedar and Sons with 6 ridge mark inside the lid. A 1923 funeral program for Ruth Cedar included a line that read, "She kept the hands that built us from forgetting what they were." A 1938 letter from Martha Cedar in Philadelphia mentioned her nephew's right-hand blessing and warned her brother not to let doctors make him ordinary. Each scrap was small. Together, they were not small at all. They suggested that Jonah's hand was part of a family identity, carried across work, worship, and migration. But the record broke where so many black records break. Names changed, addresses vanished, births went unregistered, courthouses burned, families moved north for work and left paper behind, and sometimes families chose silence because the world made visibility expensive. That was the part no scan could repair. Mara and Theo followed the Cedar line for 4 months, Savannah to Jacksonville, Jacksonville to Norfolk, Norfolk to Philadelphia, Philadelphia to Baltimore. Every time they found a possible descendant, the trail split. A son listed as a carpenter became a porter. A daughter married under a name spelled 3 different ways. A grandson appeared once in a war registration card, then disappeared into a city directory with no forwarding address. And underneath all of it was the darker question. How many children had been born with the 6th ridge and had it cut away before they were old enough to decide? In the mid-20th century, removal was often treated as routine. A doctor might say it would spare the child trouble. A school might make the child a spectacle. A parent might agree out of love, fear, or exhaustion. That meant the most visible evidence of the Cedar inheritance may have been erased from living bodies. Not by cruelty alone, sometimes by protection. That realization changed the mood of the search. It was no longer just thrilling, it was heavy. Because if every living branch carried only stories and scars, the photograph might remain the last uncut witness. Then Mara found a notice in a 1959 Baltimore neighborhood paper. It announced the retirement of Nathaniel Cedar, cabinet restorer and tuner of church organs, praised for hands his family always said could hear wood. The article mentioned one surviving daughter, Louise Cedar Price. Theo found her obituary. Louise had a daughter named Evelyn, and Evelyn was still alive. Evelyn Price was 76 years old when Mara called. She lived outside Baltimore in a brick row house with a narrow basement workshop and a front window full of plants. At first she said no, not rudely, just firmly. "My people have been stared at enough," she said. Mara did not argue. She sent a copy of the Cedar portrait and a scan of the church note. 2 days later, Evelyn called back. Her voice sounded different. "That boy," she said, "that's the hand my grandfather talked about." When Mara and Theo visited, Evelyn met them at the door wearing a gray sweater, work pants, and a carpenter's apron folded at the waist. On the dining table she had laid out a small collection, a family Bible, 2 photographs, a hand plane, a worn tuning fork, and a child's glove with 6-finger stalls stitched from soft brown leather. Evelyn touched the glove as if it were alive. "My grandfather Nathaniel made this for my brother," she said. Then she held out her own right hand. Along the outside edge, beside the pinky, was a pale surgical scar. "I had mine removed in 1952, she said. "I was 4. The room went quiet. Evelyn looked down at the scar. "My mother thought she was saving me. I don't blame her. But my grandfather would not speak to her for 3 weeks. Theo asked gently, "Did he have the 6th finger?" Evelyn nodded. "Full as any other. He said it helped him tune by feel. Said his father had it. Said his father before him had it. Said we were not supposed to call it extra." "What did he call it?" Mara asked. Evelyn smiled, but her eyes shone. "The working finger." That should have been enough. A photograph, a church register, a family Bible, a living scar. But Evelyn had one more thing. She led them into the basement. The workshop was cramped and cool. Shelves lined the walls. Old clamps hung from nails. Half-restored chairs leaned upside down on a bench. The air smelled of lemon oil and sawdust. Against the far wall sat a cedar chest, dark with age. Evelyn lifted the lid. Inside, burned into the underside, were 6 short ridges arranged like a comb. Mara felt the hairs rise on her arms. The same mark. Not decorative, not accidental. A family signature. "The men used it on work they were proud of," Evelyn said. "My grandfather told me it meant the hand was still with them." Theo ran his gloved fingers near the burn mark without touching it. Wood had remembered what paper almost lost. Evelyn agreed to help, not because she wanted attention, because her grandson, Miles, was 12. And Miles had been born with the 6th ridge. His parents had refused removal after Evelyn told them what had happened to her. Miles came home from school while Mara and Theo were still in the workshop. He was tall for his age, quiet, and suspicious of strangers until Evelyn showed him the scan. Jonah's small face appeared on the tablet, then the hand. Miles stared at it. For the first time since they arrived, Evelyn's voice trembled. "That's your people," she told him. Miles lifted his own right hand. 6 fingers, the same side, the same shape, the same calm, natural placement beside the pinky. He looked from his hand to Jonah's, then back again. "They put him in the front," Miles said. Nobody answered at first, because that was the line that mattered. They put him in the front. Not behind a chair, not with his hand hidden in a pocket, not cropped out, not corrected, in front. The genetic testing came later, with consent, explanation, and a care that Theo insisted on from the beginning. No extraction without context, no study without family ownership of the story, no language that turned the cedars into specimens. Samples from Evelyn, Miles, and 2 cousins showed what Theo expected: a hereditary variant affecting early limb development, passed in a dominant pattern through the family line. The exact science was complicated, the meaning was not. The photograph of Jonah was no longer an isolated oddity. It was the visible midpoint of a chain, at least 6 documented generations, likely more. From Isaac's father, whose name appeared only once in an 1868 labor contract, to Isaac, to Jonah, to Nathaniel, to Evelyn, to Miles. And the family language carried beside it: 6th ridge, working finger, premium hand, hands that could hear wood. Mara and Theo published a careful report through the archive, not as a spectacle, but as a collaboration with the family. No exaggerated claims, no miracle language, no pretending one gene explained every gift. They were clear about what could be proven. The Cedar family had preserved a hereditary trait across generations. They had attached meaning to it through craft. They had resisted shame long before modern institutions learned to speak respectfully about bodily difference. And one photograph, scanned at the right moment, had allowed that truth to become visible again. The public response was larger than anyone expected. Parents wrote to Evelyn asking how she had talked to Miles about his hand. Adults sent photographs of scars they had never shown outside their families. A retired carpenter from North Carolina mailed a picture of a table with 6 tiny cuts under the drawer. A woman in Ghana sent a message describing a family of carvers who called a 6th finger the hand that stays after the hand. Theo would not overstate the connection. He refused to turn resemblance into proof. But Evelyn printed the message anyway and tucked it inside the family Bible. "Some things don't need to prove everything," she said. "Sometimes they just need to keep you from feeling alone." The Cedar portrait became the center of a small exhibition at the Low Country Freedom Archive. Not a grand hall, not a marble museum, just 2 rooms, controlled light, quiet benches, and a magnified screen beside the original photograph. Visitors could stand in front of the family as people had stood for more than a century. Then they could touch the screen and zoom toward Jonah's hand. Most people gasped, not because the finger was monstrous, because it was ordinary. It rested there so naturally, so peacefully, that the shock was not the head itself. The shock was the delay. How could something be visible for so long and unseen? Evelyn answered that question on the opening night. She stood beside Miles, one hand with a scar, one boy with the finger intact, both of them facing the photograph. "When people don't expect your history to contain pride," she said, "they miss the places where pride is standing right in front of them." Miles did not speak during the program, but afterward he walked to the display case where the old leather glove rested. 6 finger stalls. hand-stitched seams. A child-sized object made by an elder who refused to let a child feel wrong. Miles looked at Evelyn. "Can I learn to make one?" he asked. Evelyn laughed through tears. "Baby," she said, "you can learn to make anything." That summer, Evelyn took Miles to Savannah. They found the address where Elias Bennett's studio had once stood. The original building was gone, replaced by brick and glass, but the street still carried the slope toward the river. They walked to the old shipyard district, where Isaac Cedar had cut and fitted timber in heat thick enough to make shirts cling to the back. A preservation group had saved one warehouse wall from the period. Inside, a few original beams remained, dark, huge, and scarred by hand tools. Evelyn asked permission before touching one. Then she placed her right hand against the wood. The scar where her sixth finger had been rested on the beam. Miles placed his hand beside hers. 6 fingers spread against the same grain. For a moment, neither of them moved. Evelyn thought of Isaac, of Ruth, of Jonah standing very still, of Nathaniel making a glove, of her mother making a choice out of fear, of herself carrying both the wound and the memory, of Miles, whose hand had not been cut. Wood does not remember the names of the men who shaped it, but it remembers pressure. It remembers angle. It remembers the blade. And sometimes, if enough people refuse to throw the pieces away, a family can read that memory back into the light. That evening, in their hotel room, Miles asked to see the photograph again. Evelyn opened the scan on her tablet. Jonah appeared, solemn and small, his right hand against his father's leg. Miles zoomed in until the fingers filled the screen. "He looks scared," Miles said. "Maybe," Evelyn answered. "Cameras were hard then. You had to hold still." "Do you think he knew people would see it?" Evelyn looked at the hand. "I think his father knew enough for both of them." Miles considered that. Then he said, "I'm glad he didn't hide." Evelyn closed her eyes, because there it was, the entire story reduced to a child's sentence. A boy in 1901 had stood still. A family had left his hand visible. An archive had kept the paper safe. A machine had noticed the detail. A descendant had answered the call. A scar had told the truth of what was almost lost. And a living child had looked back across the century and recognized himself. The cedar photograph did not become important because of the sixth finger. It became important because the sixth finger proved something the world kept trying to interrupt: continuity. A body can carry memory. A tool can carry memory. A mark burned under a chest lid can carry memory. A church note, a glove, a scar, a child's open hand. All of it can survive longer than the systems built to erase it. Jonah Cedar never knew his hand would be enlarged on a screen. He never knew strangers would count his fingers. He never knew his stillness would help a boy named Miles stand differently in his own body. He only stood where his father placed him, at the front, visible, uncorrected. And after 122 years, the world finally caught up to what his family already knew. The hand was never the secret. The seeing was.